The bitter wind off the Colorado Rockies howled like a wounded animal the day the Denver stagecoach rattled into Georgetown, carrying a bride who had already broken her only promise. Elijah Montgomery, a man built like the mountains he inhabited, stood on the muddy boardwalk, a marriage contract burning a hole in his heavy wool coat. He had sent for a sturdy, practical woman to share his isolated life. But when the coach door swung open, Stella Higgins didn't step out alone. Beside her, clutching a frayed shawl with trembling hands, was her frail, elderly mother. The town gossips fell dead silent, waiting for the mountain man's wrath. Instead, Elijah stepped forward, his voice a low rumble over the wind. "My home has room for both." Little did he know, the women had brought more than just extra luggage. They had brought a deadly secret that would test just how much a man was willing to protect. Elijah Montgomery was not a man prone to whimsy. At 36, the harsh winters and solitary summers of his timber claim on Mount Evans had carved the softness out of him, leaving behind a quiet, formidable presence. He knew the land, knew the tracks of the elk and the moods of the blizzards. But he also knew the creeping, suffocating silence of a cabin meant for more than one soul. 6 months prior, after a fever nearly took him while he was snowed in with no one to fetch water or tend a fire, Elijah made a pragmatic decision. He wrote to the Matrimonial Society of Boston. His requirements were simple: a woman of good health, practical mind, and a willingness to endure the isolation of the high country. In return, he offered a secure home, a share in his thriving timber and trapping business, and his fierce, unwavering loyalty. The letters he received in return from Miss Stella Higgins were polite, neatly penned, and entirely devoid of romance. She was 28, a seamstress, and described herself as unflinching in the face of hard work. She attached a tintype photograph, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. It was enough for Elijah. He wired the funds for her stagecoach ticket, signed the proxy papers, and prepared the cabin. Now, standing at the Georgetown depot on a freezing Tuesday in November, Elijah felt a rare knot of tension in his chest. The stagecoach ground to a halt, horses blowing plumes of steam into the frigid air. Sheriff Tom Buckley, leaning against the post office wall, gave Elijah a knowing nod. The town was waiting to see what the bear of Mount Evans had ordered. The driver swung down and yanked the carriage door open. Stella Higgins stepped out. She matched her photograph, though she was thinner, her pale blue traveling dress covered in a thick layer of prairie dust. Her eyes met Elijah's immediately, assessing him. He was a terrifying sight to a city woman 6'4", broad-shouldered, with a thick dark beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. Elijah touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Higgins, I am Elijah Montgomery." "Mr. Montgomery," Stella replied, her voice steady but her hands gripping her reticule white-knuckled. "I am relieved to finally meet you." Elijah reached for her trunk, but Stella blocked his path, her posture defensive. "Before we load the wagon, Mr. Montgomery, there is a matter I must confess. A breach of our arrangement." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You aren't married already, are you?" "No," she said quickly. Then, she turned back to the dark interior of the coach. "Mama, it is time." A collective gasp echoed from the few townsfolk lingering on the boardwalk. Slowly, painfully, Stella helped another woman descend the iron steps. Martha Higgins was perhaps 60, but she looked far older. Her skin was like translucent parchment, her frame skeletal beneath a heavy, moth-eaten coat. She leaned heavily on a hickory cane, taking short, ragged breaths of the thin mountain air. "This is my mother, Martha," Stella said, lifting her chin in an act of desperate defiance. "The letters, they were written when she was well. 2 months ago, the doctors told us the damp Boston air was killing her. They said the high, dry air of the West was her only chance. I used the money you sent to buy 2 fares instead of 1. Stella swallowed hard, her eyes bright with unshed tears of humiliation and fear. "I know this breaks our contract. I know you asked for 1 able-bodied woman, not a burden. If you wish to reject me, we will stay in town. I will find work at the laundry, and I will repay every cent of your stage fare, even if it takes me 10 years. The wind whipped down the muddy street. Sheriff Buckley shifted uncomfortably. Men in the West were known to abandon mail-order brides for far less. Elijah looked at Stella, seeing the fierce, terrifying love of a daughter backed into a corner. Then he looked at Martha. The old woman didn't cower. She met Elijah's gaze with a pair of sharp, uncompromising eyes that matched her daughter's. "I can still pluck a chicken and mend a shirt, Mr. Montgomery," Martha rasped, her voice like dry leaves. "I ain't dead yet." A slow, barely perceptible smile touched the corners of Elijah's eyes beneath his beard. He stepped past Stella, effortlessly lifting the heavy trunk from the back of the coach. "The ride up the mountain is rough, Mrs. Higgins," Elijah said quietly, hoisting the trunk onto his shoulder. "And the cabin gets cold at night. We'll need to stop at the Mercantile and buy you a heavier wool blanket." Stella stared at him, stunned. You are not sending us back?" Elijah paused, looking back at the two women shivering in the mud. "I built my cabin with my own 2 hands, Stella. I built it strong. My home has room for both." The journey up to the Montgomery claim was a grueling 4-hour ride in a springless buckboard wagon. The rutted switchbacks climbed steeply through dense stands of blue spruce and ponderosa pine. Stella sat beside Elijah on the buckboard, her body rigid, while Martha lay in the back, bundled in furs and the new wool blanket Elijah had purchased without a second thought. Elijah spoke little during the ascent, his attention focused on navigating the treacherous, icy patches on the trail. Stella took his silence for regret. Her mind raced with anxiety. Back in Boston, she had been desperate. She hadn't lied entirely about the doctor's orders regarding her mother's failing lungs, but she had omitted the true catalyst of their sudden departure. Reginald Sterling. Reginald was a ruthless debt collector who had purchased the promissory notes left behind by Stella's late father. He had offered to wipe the debt clean if Stella became his mistress. Fleeing across the country on a mountain man's dime was the only escape she could engineer. "Are you warm enough?" Elijah asked suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the creak of the wagon wheels. Stella jumped slightly. "Yes, thank you. Mr. Montgomery, I want to reiterate how grateful I am. I will work twice as hard to make up for my mother's keep." "You don't need to earn her right to breathe, Stella," Elijah said, not taking his eyes off the road. "And you can call me Elijah. We're legally bound. As of the proxy papers, let's not stand on ceremony." They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The cabin was a revelation. Stella had expected a dirt-floored hovel. Instead, she found a massive, sturdy structure made of peeled logs, featuring a wraparound porch, glass windows, and a stone chimney that puffed welcoming white smoke. Inside, it was clean, sparse, and masculine. A massive cast-iron stove dominated the main room. Elijah immediately set to work, stoking the fire. He then did something that completely unmoored Stella. Without a word, he walked to the back of the main floor, opened a door to a small, warm room adjacent to the kitchen, clearly his own bedroom, and began stripping the linens from the bed. "Your mother cannot climb the loft stairs with her lungs," Elijah stated matter-of-factly. "She will take this room. The heat from the stove radiates through the wall. You and I will take the loft." Stella felt a flush creep up her neck. The reality of her marriage sharing a private space with this towering stranger suddenly crashed down upon her. I can sleep on the floor down here, near Mama." Elijah stopped, a bundle of blankets in his arms, and looked at her. His gaze was incredibly gentle for a man of his size. "Stella, I bought you a ticket. I didn't buy your soul. The loft has 2 beds. I built the second one yesterday. You have nothing to fear from me." The first few weeks were a delicate dance of boundaries and discovery. Stella threw herself into her domestic duties, baking bread, mending Elijah's heavy canvas work clothes, and organizing the pantry. She watched Elijah carefully. He was a man of routine. He woke before dawn, chopped wood, checked his trap lines, and returned by early afternoon to work the timber on his land. The greatest surprise, however, was the bond that formed between Elijah and Martha. Martha was indeed ill. Her breathing was often labored, and there were days she couldn't leave the bed Elijah had given her. But her mind was razor-sharp. One evening, after supper, Elijah pulled out a hand-carved wooden chessboard. He set it on the table, poured 2 small glasses of amber whiskey, and looked at the old woman sitting by the fire. "You play, Martha?" he asked. "I play to win, Elijah," she croaked, shuffling over to the table. Stella watched in silent amazement from the kitchen basin as her stoic husband and her frail mother spent the next 2 hours locked in a fierce, silent battle of wits. When Martha finally checkmated him, Elijah threw his head back and let out a booming, genuine laugh that echoed off the timber walls. It was the first time Stella had heard him laugh. It made him look younger, less burdened. But the peace of their new routine was shattered one morning in late December. Stella was washing bed linens when she found a handkerchief tucked beneath her mother's pillow. It was stained with fresh, bright red blood. Panic seized her. She confronted Martha, who waved her off with a trembling hand. "I told you. Stella, my time is drawing near. The clean air bought me months, not years. I just wanted to see you safe with a good man before I went." Elijah walked in at that exact moment, stomping the snow off his boots. He saw the bloody rag in Stella's hand, saw the tears streaming down her face. He didn't panic. He walked over, placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Stella's shoulder, and looked at Martha. "We have a doctor in Georgetown. He comes up the mountain for emergencies." "No doctors," Martha wheezed stubbornly. "They'll just bleed me and charge you for the privilege." Elijah knelt beside her chair, putting himself at eye level with the old woman. "Martha, you're part of this claim now, and I protect what's mine. I'll ride down tomorrow." The following morning, Elijah saddled his massive Percheron draft horse to make the trek into Georgetown. Stella stood on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself in the freezing air. "Be careful," she said softly. It was the first time she had offered him a word of genuine affection, devoid of obligation. Elijah paused, his hand on the saddle horn. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The harsh mountain life was agreeing with Stella. The gaunt, terrified woman who stepped off the stagecoach was filling out. Her cheeks held a natural pink flush, and her eyes held less fear and more defiance. "I always am," Elijah replied. "Keep the rifle loaded. The latch on the heavy door stays dropped." Elijah rode down the mountain, but he wouldn't return alone, and he wouldn't be bringing the doctor. About 3 miles from the cabin, where the trail widened into a small plateau, Elijah found his path blocked. 4 men on horseback sat waiting, their breath pluming in the cold air. At the center was Arthur Pendleton, a wealthy, ruthless assayer from Denver who had been buying up land claims around Georgetown through coercion and foreclosure. Pendleton wore a beaver fur coat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Montgomery," Pendleton called out amiably. "Just the man I was riding up to see." "You're off the main trail, Arthur," Elijah said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. His right hand casually rested near the Winchester rifle in his scabbard. "My property line starts a mile back. A minor detail." Pendleton waved a gloved hand. "I'll get straight to the point, Elijah. My geologists have been surveying the ridge above your timber claim. They believe the silver vein from the Pelican mine extends right under your cabin." "My land isn't for sale," Elijah said flatly. "Everything is for sale," Pendleton countered, his smile vanishing. "I'm offering you double what your timber is worth. Take it. Take your new mail-order bride, and move to California. If you refuse, I'll find a way to take it. The courts in Denver are very accommodating to my interests." Elijah urged his horse forward a single step. The sheer size of him and his mount made Pendleton's men shift nervously in their saddles. "You bring surveyors onto my land, I'll shoot them for trespassing. You bring a judge's order, I'll use it for kindling. Ride back to town, Arthur." Pendleton's eyes narrowed. "You're a stubborn fool, Bear. You think you can protect 2 women out here when things get rough?" One of Pendleton's hired guns, a wiry man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, sneered. "Especially that pretty little Boston bird you bought yourself." Elijah didn't shout. He didn't curse. In a movement faster than a man his size should be capable of, he drew his Winchester, levered a round into the chamber, and leveled it directly at the scarred man's chest. "Say another word about my wife," Elijah whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the forest. The scarred man swallowed hard, raising his hands slowly. Pendleton cursed under his breath, yanking his horse's reins. "This isn't over, Montgomery. You'll sign that land over to me, one way or another." When Elijah returned to the cabin that afternoon, his face was like carved granite. He didn't tell Stella about the confrontation right away. He focused on unloading the medicinal supplies the doctor had sent up in his stead, tinctures of laudanum and eucalyptus for Martha. But trouble doesn't wait for an invitation. 3 days later, Stella was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, the freezing air biting her fingers. Elijah was out checking his traps. Suddenly, the crunch of snow caught her attention. She turned to see 3 men riding into the clearing. It was Pendleton's men, sent to intimidate the mountain man's new family while he was away. Stella dropped the frozen shirt she was holding. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just the fact that armed strangers were in her yard. It was the man leading them. The wiry man with the scar through his eyebrow pulled his horse to a halt. He looked down at Stella, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. "Well, well, well," the man drawled, pushing his hat back. "Reginald Sterling sends his regards, Miss Higgins. Or should I say, Mrs. Montgomery. He was mighty upset when you skipped out on your father's debts. Took me months to track you to this godforsaken rock." Stella couldn't breathe. The nightmare of Boston had followed her across the country, right to her front door. "Get off my husband's land," Stella managed to say, her voice shaking violently. She remembered Elijah's words, "Keep the rifle loaded." But the rifle was inside, and she was 50 feet from the porch. The man named Cohen laughed, dismounting his horse. "Your husband owes my boss a lot of money now. But Reginald ain't an unreasonable man. He said if I brought you back, the debt is settled. If you put up a fight, well, he told me to collect the debt from the old lady instead." Cohen took a step toward her, unholstering a heavy Colt revolver. "Now, be a good girl and walk to the horses." Stella backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Elijah," she screamed, praying her voice would carry into the timber. "Elijah." Cohen lunged forward, grabbing Stella by the wrist, twisting her arm painfully behind her back. She cried out, struggling against his grip. Crack! The deafening roar of a rifle shot echoed through the clearing. A chunk of bark exploded from the pine tree mere inches from Cohen's head. Cohen froze, releasing Stella as he spun around. Standing at the edge of the tree line, his eyes burning with a terrifying, primal fury, was Elijah. The Winchester was pressed to his shoulder, the barrel smoking in the cold air. He didn't look like a homesteader anymore. He looked like the apex predator of the mountain. "Take your hands off my wife," Elijah rumbled, his voice like an impending avalanche. "Or the next bullet goes through your eye." The deafening echo of the Winchester shot rolled down the valley, swallowed only by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Colorado Rockies. Cohen, his face drained of all color, scrambled backward in the snow, his hands raised in a gesture of panicked surrender. The 2 other hired men violently reined in their spooked horses, their hands hovering near their holsters but unwilling to draw against a man who already had them dead to rights. Elijah didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, measured slowness across the snow-packed yard, the rifle fixed firmly on Cohen's chest. Every crunch of his boots sounded like a judge's gavel. "I told you," Elijah repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, lacking the heat of anger, but filled with the icy certainty of a promise. "Take your hands off my wife, Montgomery." "Wait. You don't understand the whole picture," Cohen stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Pendleton bought the debt. The paper belongs to him now. $5,000. Your woman is stolen property as far as the law in Boston is concerned." Stella stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The secret was out. The crippling shame she had carried across the country was now laid bare in the freezing air for her husband to see. Elijah didn't even glance at her. He kept his eyes locked on Cohen. "She is a Montgomery. The law in Boston holds no sway on this mountain. Tell Arthur Pendleton that if he steps foot on my claim again, I won't aim for the bark. Now get off my land before I decide I don't want to waste the ammunition." Cohen scrambled to his horse, swinging into the saddle with clumsy desperation. "You're a dead man, Bear. Pendleton has half the gunmen in Georgetown on his payroll. With the Pelican Dives mine war keeping Sheriff Buckley busy, no one is coming to help you. With a brutal kick to his horse's flanks, Cohen and his men galloped back down the timber trail, kicking up a spray of white powder in their wake. Silence descended on the cabin once more, heavy and suffocating. Stella fell to her knees in the snow, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with dry, agonizing sobs. She had brought death to this man's doorstep. Elijah walked over and stood beside her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He knelt, taking her freezing, bare hands in his massive, calloused ones. $5,000, Elijah said softly. It wasn't a question, but a confirmation. I lied to you, Stella wept, refusing to look up, her tears turning to ice on her cheeks. My father was a gambler. He owed Reginald Sterling, a man who ruins people for sport. When my father died, Sterling came for the money. When I couldn't pay, he offered to forgive the debt if I became his property. The doctor told the truth about Mama's lungs, but the money you sent for my ticket was our only way out of hell. I am so sorry, Elijah. I will leave. I will walk down this mountain right now and turn myself over to them, so they leave you in peace. Elijah's grip on her hands tightened, forcing her to look up into his steely gray eyes. Do I look like a man who gives up what belongs to him? Elijah asked, his tone rough but fiercely protective. You signed the proxy, Stella. You stood in that stagecoach depot and you chose this life. And you chose me. Pendleton is a vulture. He's using your past as leverage to steal my land. Historically, vultures don't fare well against bears. He pulled her to her feet, his sheer strength, easily lifting her out of the snow. Go inside. Stoke the fire. We have work to do. The rest of the afternoon was a flurry of grim preparation. Elijah knew the history of the region. He knew Cohen wasn't lying about the distraction in town. The ongoing bloody feud over the Pelican and Dive silver mines had Georgetown in a stranglehold. Just months prior, the prominent mine owner Jacob Snyder had been gunned down in broad daylight. The local law enforcement was stretched to the breaking point, dealing with riots and retaliatory hangings. Pendleton had timed his move perfectly. He knew a shootout on an isolated timber claim wouldn't draw the sheriff's attention until the snow melted in the spring. Elijah moved through the property like a phantom, utilizing the skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness. He rigged deadfalls on the main approach trail. He laid out hidden, jawless snare lines in the brush that would snap a horse's leg if they tried to flank the cabin through the trees. He boarded up the lower half of the cabin windows with thick oak planks, leaving only narrow slits for his rifle barrel. Inside, Stella and Martha worked with a quiet, desperate efficiency. Martha, despite her rattling lungs, sat in her chair by the fire, methodically loading brass cartridges into Elijah's spare revolvers. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were stone cold. Tears won't stop lead. Stella, Martha croaked, slapping a loaded cylinder into place. You married a man of the frontier. Now you must become a woman of it. Boil water. Tear the old linens into bandages. Pray for peace, but prepare for slaughter. As dusk settled, painting the snow in shades of deep violet, the temperature plummeted dramatically. A heavy, oppressive stillness fell over the mountain. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, signaling the approach of a massive winter front. Elijah sat in a heavy wooden chair facing the reinforced oak door, his Winchester resting across his knees. Stella sat beside him, a double-barreled shotgun across her lap. Elijah had spent an hour teaching her how to brace it against her shoulder so the recoil wouldn't break her collarbone. They won't come up the main trail, Elijah whispered, his eyes scanning the narrow slits in the window boards. Pendleton is arrogant, but he ain't stupid. They'll try to cut through the North Ridge. Just past midnight, the silence was shattered. It wasn't a gunshot, but the horrific, high-pitched scream of a horse echoing from the north tree line, followed by the frantic shouting of men. One of Elijah's snares had found its mark. Stay low, Elijah commanded, instantly on his feet. He moved to the northern window slit. A volley of gunfire erupted from the darkness of the trees. Bullets thudded heavily into the thick, unyielding logs of the cabin, raining splinters onto the floorboards. Stella ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Elijah didn't flinch. He waited, his eyes tracking the muzzle flashes in the dark. He raised the Winchester, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, and a man's sharp cry of pain followed instantly. One down, Martha noted grimly from her corner near the stove, not even flinching at the noise. The exchange of gunfire was sporadic, but terrifying. Pendleton's men were laying down suppressing fire, trying to gauge the cabin's defenses. But Elijah was a ghost. He moved from window to window, firing precisely, never giving them a fixed target. He knew the layout of the land perfectly. He knew where they would seek cover, and he put bullets exactly where they were headed before they even arrived. After an hour of tense, localized skirmishing, the gunfire abruptly ceased. "Are they retreating?" Stella whispered, her voice hoarse from the gunpowder smoke filling the room. Elijah peered out into the darkness, a deep frown creasing his brow. "No. Look at the trees." Stella peeked through a slit. The towering pines were no longer visible. The world outside had vanished, swallowed by a blinding, swirling wall of white. The wind began to howl, a demonic, shrieking sound that rattled the heavy oak planks. The winter storm had arrived, and it was going to be deadly. By dawn, the mountain was entombed. The wind shrieked with a velocity that threatened to tear the heavy cedar shingles right off the roof. The snow was falling so thick and fast it created a complete whiteout. Visibility was reduced to less than 2 feet past the porch rail. The temperature had plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, the massive cast-iron stove was roaring, consuming wood at an alarming rate. Yet the cold still seeped through the chinks in the logs, forming a thin layer of frost on the inside of the window glass. Elijah stood by the door, his ear pressed to the heavy wood. "They're pinned down," Elijah said, stepping back. "No man or horse can move in this. If Pendleton's men didn't bring canvas tents and a cord of dry wood, they're freezing to death down in the lower timber." Stella felt a complicated knot of emotions. These men had come to kill her husband and drag her back to a monster in Boston. Yet, the thought of them dying in the snow, their blood freezing in their veins, made her stomach turn. "Good." Martha wheezed from her bed, her breathing sounding more ragged than usual due to the sharp drop in barometric pressure. "Let the mountain do our work for us. Saves ammunition." Around midday, Stella was at the kitchen basin, breaking the layer of ice over the water bucket with a wooden spoon, when she paused. She tilted her head toward the boarded-up window. "Elijah," she said, her voice tight. "Listen." Over the relentless roar of the wind, a sound drifted through the heavy logs. It was faint, rhythmic, and desperate. A human voice. A cry for help. Elijah walked over, his face unreadable. He listened. "It's coming from the edge of the clearing. Someone stumbled out of the trees and lost their way, probably looking for the cabin for shelter. We can't just leave him out there," Stella said, her grip tightening on the wooden spoon. Elijah looked at her, his jaw set. "Stella, that man came here with a gun to do us harm. If I open that door, I risk losing the heat in this cabin, and I risk him having a weapon drawn. He's dying." "Elijah," Stella argued, her compassion overriding her fear. "Listen to him. He sounds like a boy. We are not murderers. We defend ourselves, yes, but we do not let people freeze to death on our doorstep. Please." Elijah stared at his wife. He saw the fire in her eyes, the stubborn morality that Boston society hadn't been able to crush out of her. He let out a heavy, frustrated sigh and grabbed his heavy buffalo hide coat and a coil of rope. "Keep the shotgun leveled on the door," Elijah instructed. "If anyone comes through that door standing upright, you pull the trigger. Understand?" Stella nodded, her hands shaking as she picked up the heavy weapon. Elijah tied one end of the rope around his waist and secured the other to the heavy iron anvil near the fireplace. He unlatched the door and shoved it open against the brutal force of the wind. The blizzard instantly invaded the room, a blinding, agonizingly cold wall of white. Elijah disappeared into it. The next 5 minutes were the longest of Stella's life. The wind howled, whipping snow into the cabin, threatening to extinguish the lamps. She kept the shotgun raised, her muscles burning, praying she wouldn't have to shoot her own husband by mistake. Suddenly, the rope pulled taut. A massive, snow-covered shape breached the doorway. It was Elijah, half carrying, half dragging a figure behind him. Elijah kicked the heavy door shut, dropping the iron latch into place. Cutting off the shriek of the storm, he dropped the figure onto the floorboards. It was a young man, barely 20, his face blue, his lips cracked and bleeding. His right leg was a mangled, bloody mess, wrapped tightly in a makeshift tourniquet. He had stepped into one of Elijah's perimeter jaw traps. "Check him for weapons," Elijah ordered, breathless, pulling off his own frozen gloves. Stella quickly patted the boy down, finding only a frozen Colt revolver, which she tossed onto the table. She grabbed the extra blankets and knelt beside him. "He's practically ice." "Mama, the kettle." For the next 2 hours, the war outside was forgotten. Stella and Elijah worked in tandem to save the life of their enemy. They cut away his frozen trousers, cleaned and dressed the horrific wound on his leg, and slowly elevated his core temperature with warm broth and heated stones wrapped in flannel. When the boy finally opened his eyes, he thrashed weakly, his eyes wide with terror as he saw the giant mountain man standing over him. "Easy, son," Elijah said, his voice a low rumble. "You're inside. You're warm." The boy, whose name was Billy, began to weep, the tears leaving clean streaks through the dirt and gunpowder on his face. Cohen left me. I got caught in the iron. He said I was slowing them down. He took my horse and left me in the snow." Martha, who had been watching the ordeal silently from her bed, leaned forward, her eyes glittering with a sharp, dangerous intelligence. "Arthur Pendleton surrounds himself with cowards," Martha said, her raspy voice cutting through the boy's sobs. "And cowards are sloppy. Tell me, boy, why is Pendleton so desperate for this specific patch of dirt? There's no silver under this cabin. I know silver rock when I see it. And this is granite." Billy looked at the frail old woman, intimidated by her piercing stare. It ain't the silver," he stammered, his teeth chattering. "It's the water. Pendleton is building a massive new stamp mill down in the valley to process the ore from the Pelican dives, once he forecloses on them. But he needs a massive, steady flow of water to power the crushers. Your husband's claim sits right over the only natural spring reservoir that feeds the basin. He don't want the timber. He wants to dam the creek." Elijah and Stella exchanged a stunned look. "He forged the assay reports to make it look like a mining dispute," Billy continued, coughing weakly. "If he controls the water, he controls every mine in the Georgetown district. He'd be the richest man in the territory." Martha let out a dry, rattling chuckle. Well, knowledge is power, Elijah. Arthur Pendleton doesn't just want your land. He needs it to build his empire. That means he has a weakness." As night fell again, the blizzard continued to rage, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. The immediate threat of gunfire was replaced by the intimate, isolated reality of their survival. Billy fell into a deep, exhausted sleep by the fire. Martha, drained by the excitement, had retreated behind her partition. Stella sat at the heavy wooden table, absently tracing the grain of the wood. Elijah sat across from her, cleaning his rifle. The lantern light danced across his rugged features. "You saved his life today," Elijah said quietly, not looking up from the breech of his gun. "Despite what he came here to do, I couldn't let him die, Elijah," Stella replied softly. "I've seen enough cruelty. I won't let it live in my home." Elijah stopped his cleaning. He looked up at her, really looked at her. "Your home?" Stella felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Yes, my home. You said it yourself. I am a Montgomery now." Elijah reached across the table, his large, rough hand gently covering hers. It was the first truly tender touch between them, absent of necessity or survival. "Pendleton won't stop, Stella," Elijah warned, his thumb lightly brushing her knuckles. "When this snow clears, he'll come with more men, or he'll go to the corrupt judges in Denver. This fight is only just beginning." Stella turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. The fear that had gripped her since Boston was gone replaced by the unyielding strength of the mountain she now called home. "Then we will fight him," Stella said, her voice steady and resolute. Together, for 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard battered the Mount Evans claim, locking them in a suspended state of tense domesticity. Inside the cabin, a strange, fragile truce held. Billy, the wounded hired gun, lay near the stove, his fever breaking under Stella's diligent care and Martha's potent willow bark teas. He was no longer a threat. He was a terrified boy who realized his ruthless employer had left him for dead. When the morning of the 4th day finally broke, the shrieking wind died down, leaving behind a mountain buried beneath 5 feet of pristine, silent white snow. The sky was a blinding, crystalline blue. Elijah stood on the porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, assessing the blinding landscape. Stella stepped out beside him, wrapping a thick wool shawl tightly over her shoulders. The air was so cold it burned the inside of her lungs. "The snow is crusted over," Elijah observed, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, thick enough to bear the weight of snowshoes. "By noon, it'll hold a horse if I stick to the ridge trail." Stella looked up at him, her heart giving a nervous flutter. "You're going down to Georgetown. Sitting up here waiting for Arthur Pendleton to thaw out is a fool's game," Elijah replied, turning to face her. "He owns the assayers and he's got the local deputies in his pocket, but he doesn't own the federal courts. I'm riding down to telegraph Federal Circuit Judge Moses Hallett in Denver. Hallett is a strict constructionist when it comes to the General Mining Act of 1872. If I file a preemptive claim on the subterranean water rights proving Pendleton falsified a silver assay to steal a public watershed, Hallett will issue a federal injunction. Pendleton will have United States Marshals breathing down his neck instead of local hired guns." Stella nodded slowly, grasping the dangerous brilliance of the plan. Elijah wasn't just a brute force of nature. He stays here. "He's your insurance," Elijah said, stepping closer. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand gently cupping Stella's cheek. It was a stark contrast to the harshness of their surroundings. "If Pendleton's men show up before I get back, you use the boy. You tell them you have a signed, sworn affidavit from William Hodges detailing Pendleton's conspiracy and the forged assay reports. You tell them if a single bullet hits this cabin, that affidavit goes straight to the territorial governor." Elijah dropped his hand, his expression hardening back into the bear of Mount Evans. "Keep the shotgun loaded, Stella. I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow." Watching Elijah ride away, his massive silhouette shrinking against the vast white expanse, Stella felt a profound sense of isolation. But it wasn't the terrified, suffocating isolation she had felt in Boston. This was the heavy, solemn weight of responsibility. She walked back inside, barring the heavy oak door behind her. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Stella kept herself busy, baking hardtack and cleaning the ash from the stove, while Martha sat in her chair, her breathing shallow but her eyes sharp, constantly watching the boarded-up windows. It was mid-afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks and cast long blue shadows across the snow, that the silence was broken. It wasn't the sound of horses. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of boots on the icy crust of the snow. Someone was approaching on foot. Stella immediately dropped her mending and grabbed the double-barreled shotgun from the table. She moved to the narrow slit in the window boarding. A lone figure was dragging himself out of the tree line. It was Cohen. The scarred man hadn't frozen to death after all. He had survived the blizzard in one of Elijah's abandoned trapping blinds. And now, half-starved, frostbitten, and driven by a venomous cocktail of vengeance and greed, he had come back to finish the job. He had likely watched Elijah ride out that morning and waited for his moment. "Mama," Stella whispered, her voice remarkably steady. "Get behind the stove." Martha didn't argue. She shuffled behind the massive iron fixture, pulling a heavy Colt revolver from the pocket of her apron. Billy, lying on his pallet, paled significantly. "It's Cohen," the boy rasped. "He's crazy, ma'am. He won't listen to reason." "I don't intend to reason with him," Stella said, stepping back from the window and leveling the shotgun at the heavy oak door. Bang, bang, bang. Cohen pounded the butt of his rifle against the door. "Open up, little Boston bird." His voice drifted through the heavy timber, ragged and manic. "I saw your big, bad mountain man ride off. It's just you, me, and the debt now. Reginald Sterling is going to pay me double when I drag you back by your hair. Arthur Pendleton is finished." "Cohen," Stella shouted back, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even her. "We know about the water rights. We have Billy in here, and he has confessed to everything. The federal judge in Denver is already signing the injunction." There was a pause outside. Then, a harsh, humorless laugh. "You think I care about Pendleton's water?" Cohen sneered. "Pendleton stopped paying me the second the snow started falling. I'm here for the $5,000 bounty on your pretty head, Mrs. Montgomery. Now, you can open this door, or I can burn this cabin to the ground with you and the old bat inside." Stella's blood ran cold. The logs were thick, but the roof was cedar shingle, and it was dry beneath the snow. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the cabin. Cohen wasn't at the front door anymore. He had thrown a heavy piece of firewood through the glass of the small kitchen window, bypassing the thick oak boards. Stella spun around. A frostbitten, bloodied hand reached through the jagged glass, fumbling for the interior latch. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped Stella's chest. The nightmares of Boston, of Reginald Sterling's suffocating grasp, rushed back. But then she looked at her mother, frail and trembling, and she remembered Elijah's words. "Do I look like a man who gives up what belongs to him?" Stella was a Montgomery now, and she would not be taken. She marched directly toward the kitchen window, ignoring the freezing wind howling through the broken pane. Cohen's face appeared in the opening, his eyes wild, his lips pulled back in a feral grin as he raised his revolver to shoot her through the gap. Stella didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She shoved the twin barrels of the shotgun directly through the broken window, pressing the cold steel right against Cohen's chest. Cohen's eyes went wide. The feral grin vanished. "Tell Reginald Sterling," Stella said, her voice dropping to an icy, deadened calm, "that my debt is paid in full." She pulled the right trigger. The roar in the confined space of the cabin was deafening. The recoil threw Stella hard to the floorboards, her shoulder erupting in agony. Outside, Cohen was thrown backward into the snowbank with the force of a battering ram. He did not get back up. Silence descended on the cabin once more, save for the ringing in Stella's ears and the soft, ragged breathing of her mother. Stella slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her shoulder throbbing violently. She walked to the window and looked out. The snow was stained a stark, brilliant crimson. The nightmare from Boston was finally over. Martha lowered her Colt, a grim smile touching her wrinkled lips. "Well done, daughter," she croaked. "You are a woman of the West now." When Elijah returned the following afternoon, his massive Percheron horse lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperatures, he found his yard fundamentally changed. The body of the scarred man had been dragged to the edge of the tree line and covered with a heavy canvas tarp. Elijah kicked the door open, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rare display of sheer panic. He stopped dead in the doorway. Stella was sitting at the table, methodically cleaning the soot from the shotgun barrels with an oiled rag. Her dress was stained. Her hair was escaping her severe bun in wild tendrils, and a massive, dark bruise was already forming on her right shoulder. She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes tired, but possessing a steel he had never seen before. "He came back," Stella said simply, setting the rag down. "He wanted the Boston bounty. He won't be collecting it." Elijah crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't ask if she was all right. He could see that she was changed, forged in the fire of the frontier. He pulled her out of the chair and wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. It was a fierce, desperate embrace, a silent acknowledgement of the terrifying reality that he could have lost her. Stella wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his heavy canvas coat, finally allowing a few tears of relief to fall. "Judge Hallett sent the wire," Elijah murmured against her hair. "The injunction is signed. The U.S. Marshals are riding up from Denver on the morning train. But we need to end this today, Stella. I won't have Pendleton plotting in the shadows for the rest of our lives." 2 hours later, a grim procession made its way down the winding mountain trail. Elijah drove the buckboard wagon. Stella sat beside him, her back straight, the shotgun resting across her lap. In the back, bundled in furs, lay Billy, clutching a piece of paper signed in his own blood, and witnessed by Martha Higgins a full confession of Arthur Pendleton's conspiracy to steal the watershed. They rode into Georgetown just as the saloons were filling up for the evening. The muddy streets were packed with miners, prospectors, and merchants. When the Bear of Mount Evans pulled his wagon to a halt in front of the Georgetown assayer's office, the street fell dead silent. Sheriff Tom Buckley, tipped off by the commotion, stepped out of his office, his hand resting cautiously on the butt of his revolver. Arthur Pendleton, wearing his immaculate beaver fur coat, stepped out onto the boardwalk, surrounded by 3 of his remaining hired guns. He looked at the wagon, his arrogant smile faltering slightly when he saw Stella holding the shotgun, and faltering completely when he saw Billy lying in the back. "Montgomery," Pendleton sneered, trying to maintain his composure for the watching crowd. "I see you finally decided to come down from your rock. Ready to sign the deed over?" Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood up in the buckboard, his towering frame casting a long shadow in the dying light. "Arthur Pendleton." Elijah's voice boomed down the street, echoing off the wooden storefronts. "I have just received a telegraph from Federal Circuit Judge Moses Hallett. He has issued an emergency federal injunction against your company, halting all development of the Pelican Dives stamp mill." A murmur rippled through the crowd of miners. Pendleton's face flushed purple. "You're bluffing, you backwoods savage. Hallett has no jurisdiction over territorial mining disputes. He does when the dispute involves the fraudulent acquisition of a public watershed." Stella spoke up, her voice clear and carrying across the silence. She stood up beside Elijah, holding up the blood-stained affidavit. "We have the sworn confession of your hired man, William Hodges. You falsified silver assays to illegally seize the water rights beneath our claim to power your mill. You attempted to murder my husband and me to cover it up." Sheriff Buckley stepped off the boardwalk, walking toward Pendleton. "Is this true, Arthur? It's a lie." Pendleton barked, gesturing wildly to his men. They forced the boy to sign it. "Shoot them, damn you." His men hesitated. They looked at Elijah, standing tall and unbothered with his Winchester, and they looked at Stella, aiming a double-barreled shotgun directly at them. Then, they looked down the street, where the distinct, rhythmic whistle of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway train echoed through the valley. The U.S. Marshals had arrived early. Pendleton's hired guns slowly raised their hands, backing away from their employer. They were paid to intimidate homesteaders, not to swing from a federal gallows. Pendleton stood alone on the boardwalk, his empire crumbling into dust around him. Sheriff Buckley unhooked a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Arthur Pendleton, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, forgery, and attempted murder, pending the arrival of the United States Marshals." The crowd erupted into cheers. The tyranny of the corrupt assayer was over. Elijah looked down at Stella, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his bearded face. He reached out, gently taking the shotgun from her bruised shoulder. "The fight is over, Mrs. Montgomery. Let's go home." Spring arrived late on Mount Evans, but when it did, it brought a breathtaking explosion of life. The snow melted, transforming the mountain into a vibrant tapestry of green alpine grass and brilliant purple columbines. The subterranean spring, now legally leased to a legitimate Denver mining conglomerate with the blessing of the federal courts, provided Elijah and Stella with a steady, exorbitant income that required them to do nothing but let the water flow. They used the money to build a massive addition to the cabin, complete with a wraparound glass conservatory where Martha could sit in the warmth and watch the elk graze. Martha lived to see the first snows of the following winter. She passed away peacefully in her sleep one quiet November night, her lungs finally giving out, but her heart entirely at peace. She died knowing her daughter was no longer a frightened, indebted seamstress, but a fierce, respected woman of the frontier. The debt to Reginald Sterling in Boston was nullified. When Sterling attempted to collect from Pendleton's seized assets, the federal courts exposed his predatory lending practices, resulting in his own imprisonment back east. One evening, a year after the stagecoach had arrived in Georgetown, Elijah and Stella sat on their porch. The mountain air was crisp, but they were wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide, perfectly warm. Elijah held Stella close, his arm a heavy, comforting weight around her shoulders. "Did I ever tell you?" Stella murmured, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. "That when I saw your photograph in Boston, I thought you looked like the most terrifying man on earth?" Elijah let out a low rumble of laughter that vibrated against her cheek. "I asked for a sturdy, practical woman. I got a warrior and a mother-in-law who could outsmart a politician. I'd say I got the better end of the contract." Stella smiled, turning her face to kiss his jaw. The contract had brought her to the mountain, but it was love hard-fought, blood-stained, and deeply unyielding that would keep her there forever. The tale of Elijah and Stella Montgomery stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of survival and the profound depths of human resilience. What began as a desperate business transaction, a marriage of convenience forged to escape the ghosts of the East, transformed into a legendary partnership in the untamed heart of the Colorado Territory. Stella discovered that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it, while Elijah learned that the walls he built to keep out the harshness of the world were best used to protect those he loved. Together, they proved that a home is not defined by its location or the roughness of its timber, but by the fiercely loyal hearts beating within it. The mountain man asked for a bride, but he received a family, proving that even in the wildest frontiers, the most powerful force of all is a love that simply refuses to break.